Hill 192 does not look like anything, and in July of 1944, it was the most valuable piece of dirt in Normandy. It is not a mountain, it is not a fortress, just a swelling in the ground east of Saint-Lô, 630 feet above the sea, so gentle that on a summer morning you would not notice you had climbed. Hedgerows, sunken lanes, apple trees, cattle, mud that never dries. But from its crest, a man with binoculars could see the roads into Saint-Lô, and Saint-Lô was the hinge the entire American army was waiting to swing on. The Germans knew it. They had put paratroopers on it. Men of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, a division raised only months before, stiffened with hardened paratroop cadre, and some of the most stubborn defensive infantry in Europe. They had dug into the hedgerow banks, cut firing slits at ankle height, roofed their positions with logs and earth. They had registered every approach. They had done everything the training told them to do. And then the Americans began to shoot at the hill and did not stop. Not at the paratroopers. At the hill, 20 times on-target concentrations in a single night, fired by the artillery of one American division, the 2nd Infantry Division, whose commander, Major General Walter M. Robertson, a 56-year-old career officer with a mild professorial face, would take the crest on the 11th of July. A time on target is not one gun. It is a piece of choreography. Battalions of howitzers scattered across miles of countryside, each calculating the flight time of its own shells, each firing at a different second, so that every round from every gun arrives at the same instant. No warning whistle. No first shell to warn you into your hole. The sky simply falls, all at once, everywhere. 20 of those in one night on one hill. To the north, the Infantry Division's artillery, under Brigadier General William H. Sands, was doing its own arithmetic. On a single day in mid-July, his guns fired 459 fire missions. More than 13,000 rounds in 24 hours. 13,000 shells. One hill, one day. When American reconnaissance aircraft photographed the ground afterward, the hill had lost its shape. Craters, overlapping craters. A moth-eaten blanket, one officer called it. The hedgerows were gone. The apple trees were gone. Whole sections of the sunken lanes had simply been erased and rewritten as holes. Here is the part that broke the German mind. Most of those shells did not hit anyone. They were not meant to. The Americans shelled hedgerows they had already shelled. They shelled hedgerows they had already cleared. They shelled roads with nobody on them. They shelled the reverse slope where a German company might have been and was not. They shelled empty ground at 2 in the morning, then again at 3, then again at 4, and then they stopped. And then, just as a man let his shoulders down, they started again. To a German artillery officer, this was not warfare. This was malpractice. You have to understand what a German gunner was. He was the product of an army that had made a religion out of scarcity, because scarcity was the only truth it had ever known. By the end of 1941, on the Russian front, a heavy German artillery unit could expect to have something in the order of 50 rounds on hand per gun. 50 is not a stockpile. That's an afternoon. That is the difference between holding a sector and watching your barrels go cold while men come at you across open snow. It did not get better, it got worse. Heinrich Eberbach, 48 years old, a career soldier commanding 5th Panzer Army against the British in Normandy in that same summer, left a record of what his artillery actually was. His guns came from every major power in Europe. French pieces taken in 1940, Czechs pieces taken in 1939, Soviet pieces dragged back from the East. Some of them had been made for the last war. Every type needed its own shells, its own firing tables, its own spare parts, its own doctrine of use. Half of the Wehrmacht's artillery on the Eastern Front, by one accounting, was French. And in Normandy, the artillery supporting Eberbach's army could fire roughly 1/10 of what the British fired against it. So the German gunner counted. He counted because his life depended on counting. He was taught, drilled, examined, and promoted on a single mental discipline. Every round has a destination. Every round has a purpose. Every round is justified before it leaves the tube. Waste nothing. Aim everything. Put that man on the eastern slope of Hill 192 in July of 1944 and let him watch 30,000 shells land on empty ground. He will reach the only conclusion his entire professional education permits him to reach. The Americans are amateurs. He was wrong. And the reason he was wrong has his name, and the name is not a weapon. The Americans called it harassing and interdiction fire. H&I, 3 words in a manual, with a line item in an ammunition budget, signed off by a colonel who would never see the ground he was shooting at. The idea is so simple that it took an industrial country to believe it. You do not have to kill him. You only have to break him. Take a crossroads 12 kilometers behind the German line. You can't see it. You have no observer on it. But, because any competent commander would move supplies at night, that trucks and mess carts and ammunition and wounded men must pass through it in the dark. So you drop a shell on it at 0223. Nothing in particular, one shell. Another at 0307, another at 041. Oh, not a barrage, not a preparation, not an attack, just steel arriving in the dark at no rhythm a man can learn. And what happens? The column does not move, or it moves and loses a truck and stops. Or it takes the long way and arrives at dawn when the fighter bombers are up. Or the driver, who has been awake for 36 hours because a different crossroads got the same treatment last night, closes his eyes for 2 seconds and puts the vehicle into a ditch. Or the food does not come. And by the following afternoon, there are men in holes on Hill 192 who have not eaten in 2 days and are shaking, and have not slept, and who will still be shelled tonight. Not one of them was hit. Every one of them was defeated. The Americans were not shooting at the German soldier. They were shooting at his sleep, at his stomach, at his nerve, at his belief that silence meant safety. They were filling the space between a man and his rest with an endless series of small steel hammers, and they had decided, at the level of doctrine in writing, that a shell which killed nobody had still done its work. Now here is the thing that everybody gets wrong. Here is where the easy story, the story about rich Americans and their bottomless factories, falls apart. That doctrine was not born of wealth, it was born of poverty. Go back 13 years, not to Normandy, to Oklahoma. Fort Sill in the 1920s and early 1930s was the home of the United States Field Artillery School, and it belonged to an army that was, by any measure, broke. The budgets had been cut and cut again. The guns were leftovers from the last war. There were not enough shells to train with. There were not enough trucks, so they still used horses. An officer could spend a decade in grade. The United States Army in those years was not a great powers army. It was a small, shabby, underfunded institution that most of the country had stopped thinking about. And inside the gunnery department at that school, a major named Carlos Bruber began pulling the entire craft of artillery apart. He threw out the old method of describing a target by terrain feature and started over. He introduced a firing chart. He had batteries' positions located by proper survey. He designated targets by reference to a base point on the chart, so that any gun, anywhere, could be pointed at the same spot from the same mathematics, which meant that guns which could not see each other could now shoot at the same thing at the same time. In the spring of 1931, the gunnery department demonstrated it. The massed fire of an entire battalion controlled from one place. Brewer's successor took the idea further. His name was Orlando Ward, a career artilleryman, a serious, dry, precise man, and he built the thing that made all of it work. He created the Fire Direction Center. One room, one set of charts, one officer who could take a request from a man lying in a hedgerow, and minutes later drop the guns of a dozen batteries on a map reference that nobody at the guns had ever laid eyes on. Lieutenant Colonel H.L.C. Jones would follow and refine it and push it out into the wider artillery community until it became the way America shot. Understand what that means. The system that let the United States pour 13,000 shells onto an empty hill in Normandy was invented by men who did not have enough shells to practice with. It was designed in a decade of scarcity by an army that expected to be poor forever. The Germans looked at American artillery and saw abundance and called it waste. They were looking at the wrong thing entirely. The Americans were not richer. They were wired differently. They had built a nervous system. And Orlando Ward, the man who built it, did not get to keep his war. In 1943, in Tunisia, Ward was a major general commanding the 1st Armored Division. It was a hard, unhappy command. The division had been bled at Kasserine. It had been broken up and handed out in pieces. It's been sent to attack a place called McNair against dug-in defenders on high ground, and it had not taken it. And Ward had gone forward himself into the fighting and been wounded in the face and come back. It did not matter. In April of 1943, George S. Patton, 57 years old, newly installed to save the American position in North Africa, a man who believed that a general's job was to attack, and that any general who did not attack should be replaced, relieved him. Orlando Ward, the man who had invented the Fighter Direction Center, was sent home. The machine went to Europe. The man who built it did not. That is the shape of this story, and you should hold it in your hands now, because everything that follows will bend around it. The Germans on Hill 192 believed they were watching a rich army throw away its ammunition because it did not know any better. They were watching a poor army's invention, running at full industrial scale, operated a nation that had done a piece of arithmetic the Wehrmacht could not afford to do. And the arithmetic was not about shells at all. It was about how many years it takes to make a man. The arithmetic was this. It takes a factory a few months to make an artillery shell, or it takes a country 18 years to make a soldier. And the United States Army in 1944 did not have soldiers to spend. That sounds absurd. A nation of 130 million people. The arsenal of democracy. Ships stacked at Southampton. But go look at the ledger, and the ledger tells a different story. And the ledger is the only thing that ever tells the truth. The Army capped its ground divisions at 89 divisions, to fight the Wehrmacht in Europe and the Imperial Japanese Army across the Pacific, and to garrison half the world while doing it. Germany fielded hundreds, the Soviet Union fielded hundreds, and the richest country on earth chose to build 89 and stop. Historians would come to call it the 90-division gamble, and the man who placed that bet was a 61-year-old lieutenant general named Leslie J. McNair. Remember that name? You will need it before this chapter is over, and when you need it, it is going to hurt. McNair commanded Army Ground Forces. That means he built the American Ground Army. Every division, every training center, every level of organization, had every man and troops in England, had been shaped somewhere along the way by a decision Leslie McNair made at a desk. He had graduated West Point 1904. He was an artilleryman by branch. He was thin, unsmiling, disliked ceremony, and he had a habit of standing in the rain watching maneuvers when he could have been indoors. He was also, and almost nobody outside the War Department knew this, profoundly deaf. He wore a hearing aid. He kept it quiet. It cost him the field command he wanted more than anything in the world, and he went back to his desk and kept building other men's armies instead. He was not a great captain. Let us be honest with each other, because this story does not need a hero and it does not deserve one. Some of what McNair built failed. His tank destroyer doctrine, the idea that you would hold light, fast, thin-skinned guns in reserve and rush them to wherever the German armor broke through, did not survive contact with reality. His divisions were lean by design, stripped of what he considered fat, and in the autumn of 1944, the American Army in Europe would find itself exceptionally short of infantry replacements, because the machine had been built to be economical, and war is not economical. He made mistakes, big ones. Men died from them. But the central bet he made was this: fewer divisions, fewer riflemen, and in exchange, guns. Enormous, disproportionate, faintly ridiculous quantities of guns, and the fire direction system to make them all speak at once, and a doctrine that told a battery commander, when in doubt, shoot. Shoot at where he might be. Shoot at the road he might use tonight. Shoot at the crossroads, at the tree line, at the reverse slope, at the empty field, at the nothing. Because a shell costs a machinist in Pennsylvania an afternoon, and a 19-year-old from Ohio costs 18 years, and his mother. That was the American answer to the German gunner counting his 50 rounds. It was not wealth. It was not carelessness. It was a trade, a cold, deliberate, written-down trade, steel for flesh, made by men in Washington who knew exactly what they were buying and exactly what they were selling. And in July of 1944, in a Norman apple orchard, the bill came due on the man who signed it. Operation Cobra was supposed to end the stalemate. 6 weeks after the landings, the Americans were still stuck. Every hedgerow was a wall. Every field was a box with 4 walls of dirt and roots, 8 feet thick, 400 years old, and behind each one a machine gun. The bocage had swallowed the greatest amphibious invasion in the history of the world and was digesting it slowly, one squad at a time, and men were dying by hundreds for orchards you could walk across in 90 seconds. Omar Bradley wanted a hole, not a dent. A hole. He drew a rectangle on the map along the road from Saint-Lô to Perriers, 7,000 yards long, 2,500 deep, and he asked the Air Forces to erase everything inside it. He said he wanted craters. He wanted the ground torn up so completely that nothing living remained. He got what he asked for, and he got other things too. The bombers came on the 24th of July. The weather turned as they crossed the channel. The target went under cloud. Recall orders went out over the radio. Some crews did not hear them. Some heard them too late, with the bomb bay doors already open and the run already begun. The bombs fell short. They fell on the 30th Infantry Division, the old Hickory boys, National Guardsmen from the Carolinas and Tennessee and Georgia, waiting in their start positions on the American side of the road. 25 men killed, 131 wounded, their own bombs, their own Air Force. Men buried alive in slit trenches by earth their own countrymen threw into the sky, and their friends digging with helmets and entrenching tools and bare hands to get them out before they suffocated in the dark. Bradley was furious. He had asked for the bombers to run parallel to the road, along the front, so that any error would carry sideways instead of backward. They had come in perpendicular, straight over the heads of the American infantry. There would be arguments about that for the rest of everyone's natural life. Who said what? Who understood what? Whether it had ever been possible at all, none of it mattered to the men in the ground. And then, and this is the part that is almost impossible to sit with, and I am not going to soften it for you, they did it again the next day, because the operation could not wait, because the Germans now knew something was coming, because the war does not stop to bury anybody. On the morning of the 25th of July, the men of the 30th Division walked back into the exact positions they had just been bombed out of. And they lay down, and they waited, and they listened to the sound coming out of the north. Around 1,500 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s, more than 3,000 tons of bombs from the heavies alone, and close to 1,000 tons more from the mediums and the fighter bombers behind them. It was one of the most concentrated aerial bombardments of the entire war, poured onto a strip French farmland a man could walk across in an hour. The soldiers who lived through it said you felt it in your organs, or you heard it in your ears. The ground did not shake. The ground moved. Men were lifted off the earth and set back down. Ernie Pyle was there. Pyle, the little Indiana newspaperman who had spent more nights in more foxholes than any correspondent of the war, who wrote about privates and not generals, whose columns your father or your grandfather read at the kitchen table. Pyle was caught in it. He called it the most sustained, horrible thing he had ever been through. And here is what went wrong, and it is almost stupid in its simplicity: the dust. The first waves threw up so much smoke and pulverized dirt that the following waves could not see the road they had been told to aim beside. So they aimed at the dust, and the dust was drifting north toward the Americans. Bombs walked backward across the road, into the orchards, into the hedgerows, into the slits trenches, wave after wave, and each wave aiming a little farther back than the last, because each wave was aiming at the mess the wave before it had made. 111 Americans killed, 490 wounded. The 30th Division alone logged 164 cases of combat exhaustion out of that single morning. Men who were not hit and never came back anyway. Among the dead was an Associated Press photographer named Bede Irvin from Des Moines, who had gone forward to photograph the bombardment and had a camphor in his hand. And in a slit trench in a field near a hamlet called Chapelle-en-Juger, there was a deaf 61-year-old lieutenant general who had come up as observer. This is because he wanted to see his eyes whether the army he had designed actually worked. Leslie J. McNair, the man who had capped the division, the man who had decided that America would fight this war with shells instead of suns. They found him about 60 feet from where he had been standing. They knew him by the 3 stars on his collar. There was no other way to know him. Sit with that for a moment. Don't rush past it. The architect of American firepower, obliterated by American firepower. In a field he could not hear coming because he was deaf, and the man beside him could not shout loud enough. And the sky came apart above a man who had spent 4 years with doctrine that said sky should come apart. The highest-ranking American officer killed in the European theater. And then the second blow, the one almost nobody tells you, they could not announce it. McNair had been slated to take command of the 1st U.S. Army Group, the Ghost Army. The formations existed only face radio trafficking and inflate tanks and imaginary shoulder barrages, whose entire purpose was to keep the German High Command convinced that the real invasion had not happened yet, that it was still coming at Calais, that the divisions sitting up there must not move. If the Germans learned that McNair was dead in Normandy, they would learn the Ghost had no commander. The deception could come apart, could start moving, so they buried him in secret. 6 men at the grave: Bradley, Hodges, Quesada, Royce, his aide, and Patton. No band, no rifle volley, no flag folded and handed to anyone. A 3-star general of the United States Army, put into the ground of France with 6 men watching, and the fact of it stamped classified. His wife was told he was dead. The country was not told how, and for weeks afterward, the American press reported that Leslie McNair had been killed by German fire. That was the first invoice, now the second. Across the road, inside that rectangle, was the Panzerslayer Division. It was the most lavishly equipped armored division Germany ever fielded, and here is what made it strange. It had been built out of the demonstration and training units of the German armored schools. Panzerslayer was made of instructors, the men who taught other men how to fight tanks. Its commander was Fritz Bayerlein, 45 years old, Rommel's old chief of staff from Africa. Short, blunt, professional, a man who had seen the desert and the Eastern Front and believed he understood the outer limits of what could be done to an army. He learned that morning that he had been wrong about the limits. He described the bombers coming over in a conveyor belt that would not stop. Carpet after carpet laid down back and forth, patient, unhurried, mechanical. Guns overturned. Tanks flipped onto their backs like beetles. The roads and tracks not blocked, gone, unmapped, rewritten as craters touching rim to rim. He had a word for what his front looked like afterward. Mondlandschaft, a moonscape, every telephone line cut, no working crowley and rigos, no way to give an order and no way to receive one. He could not command what he could not reach, and so for hours he did not command anything at all. And his men, by his own account, some of them went mad. Not in the poetic sense. They came up out of the earth and ran in the open, in daylight, into the fire, because the ground had stopped being ground, and there is nothing in any manual, in any army, in any language, that tells a soldier what to do when the world itself comes apart. Bayerlein put his losses at something in the order of 70% of his forward troops. Dead, wounded, crazed, numb. That last word is the one to hold. Numb, not routed, not broken. Numb. The condition a man reaches when he has been under steel for so long that the part of him that makes decisions has switched off, and he sits in a hole and stares at his hands and does not react when you shake him by the shoulder. That is what industrial firepower does to instructors, to the men who taught the German army how to fight. Panzer came out of that sector with a handful of running tanks. Reports put it at about 7. But here is the thing you must not miss, and it is a discipline this story requires of us. Bayerlein wrote all of that afterward, in captivity, for American interrogators, and then for historians, and a defeated general describing his defeat has powerful reasons to make the hammer that hit him sound like the hand of God. Because if it was the hand of God, it was not his fault. Every serious historian who uses Bayerlein uses him with a pair of tongs. The moonscape was real. The 70% may be a proud man rounding upward in the direction of his own innocence. Keep that instinct sharp. Because we are about to take the Belgian in this entire story and break it over our knee. There is a picture every American has of the U.S. Army in Europe, the river of steel, the bottomless magazine, the gunner who never counts because the next truck is already grinding up the road behind him. It is a beautiful picture. It is not true. By the autumn of 1944, the United States Army on Europe ran out of ammunition. Not grew tight, not felt the pinch, ran out. Here is how it happened. And it is not a heroic story, which is precisely why you have never heard it. Through the summer, the problem was ports. There weren't any. Cherbourg had been systematically wrecked by its own garrison before it surrendered. Most supply was still open beaches, and you cannot land artillery ammunition on a beach in the quantities an army like this consumes. From June to November, the bottleneck was simply the capacity to get the stuff off the ships. Then the front broke and the armies ran, and the problem changed shape. Now the shells were in France, and the fighting was 400 miles away, and the railroads were destroyed, and every single ton had to move by truck. And then, from November onward, came the worst of it, the part that would have made a German gunner laugh until he wept. The factories in the United States could not produce enough, not enough artillery shells. In America, in 1944, the Army Service Forces began releasing servicemen back to the foundries. They furloughed men, thousands of them, 90 days at a time, to go home and make 105mm ammunition. In December of 1944, Washington went looking for men who had walked away from essential war industry jobs so they could be drafted as punishment. That is not the arsenal of democracy at flood tide. That is a country scraping the barrel, and the men at the front felt every bit of it. In October of 1944, with the American armies pressed up against the Siegfried Line, 12th Army Group cut the field artillery ammunition allowance so severely that offensive operations were, in the words of the record, precluded, not discouraged, precluded. You could not attack. There was nothing to attack with. In 3rd Army, Patton's army, the army of the man who told his railmen that if they could not see the enemy, they should at least shoot at the place where he was likely to be. Field artillery expenditure was slashed so far that, for weeks, the guns fired less in a month than they would spend in a single day once the Bulge began. 95%. The most aggressive gunnery culture on the planet, sitting on its hands in the rain. And the ammunition that did arrived broken. Shells come in manufacturing lots, and the propellant in each lot burns slightly differently. And if you mix lots, your rounds do not land where the mathematics says they should. In the rush to clear the beaches, lots got shuffled like a deck of cards. One section of a 3rd Army ammunition supply point found 7,445 rounds of 105mm, drawn for 308 separate sources. By November, 1st Army had burned 25,000 man-hours sorting ammunition by hand. Men in the mud, in the cold, reading stencils off shell casings by flashlight, so the guns would shoot straight. So they improvised. And what they improvised is the most humiliating, most magnificent detail in this entire. They picked up German gun 6th Corps, and to a lesser extent 12th Corps, went out and turned captured enemy artillery for its former owners, firing captured enemy ammunition. Russian 76 2mm guns, German 88s, German 105mm howitzers, German 150s, French Schneider 155s, left over from another war entirely, whose shells they discovered would work in the American M1 howitzer. On the 26th of December 1944, in the middle of the Battle of the Bulge, gunners of the 244th Field Artillery Battalion were photographed firing a captured German 88, the richest army in the history of warfare, with German guns, because it could not get enough of its own shells forward. That is the truth underneath the legend. And now it gets stranger and darker and funnier in that bitter way that only real history is funny. Because the rationing system, the bureaucratic machine built specifically to conserve ammunition, produced waste. Think about what a ration does to a battery commander. You are told, this week you may fire this many rounds, and next week's allocation will be based, in part, on what you did with this week's. So what happens if you are careful? What happens if you conserve, if you shoot only at confirmed targets, if you behave exactly the way a German officer would behave, is exactly the way the Truppenführung would demand? Your allocation drops, and then the Germans counterattack on a Thursday morning in the fog, and your guns have nothing to say. So the American battery commander did the rational thing. And the rational thing was the insane thing. He shot off his ration. At the end of the week, if he had rounds he could not carry over, he fired them at a crossroads, at a tree line, at a suspected assembly area, at absolutely nothing, because unfired shells were not evidence of discipline. Unfired shells were evidence that he did not need them, and some of them falsified the expenditure reports outright, reported firing more than they fired, quietly stacked the difference behind the gun pits, building private hordes against the day the front came apart. The official record says it flatly. The rationing system encouraged wasteful firing, and it encouraged falsified reports. Now go back. Go back to that German paratrooper in his hole, watching shells drop on empty ground at ZO223, and ZO307, and 0418, and concluding that the Americans were amateurs. He was right. Some of it, a real, documented, measurable portion of it, was exactly what it looked like. It was waste, not the cold, calculated denial of possibility, not the trade of steel for flesh. Just a lieutenant colonel emptying his weekly quota into a Belgian forest so that a clerk in a rear headquarters 200 miles away would not cut his numbers. That is the thing nobody says out loud. The German was reading the Americans through the wrong lens, but he was not hallucinating. Theirs was madness in what he saw. Some of it was genius wearing the mask of madness, and some of it was just madness. And one last thing, before we go to the ridge. When Americans want to explain how they won this war, they reach for a photograph, and it is a true photograph, and it is misunderstood almost every time it is used. The Red Ball Express. From the 25th of August to the 16th of November 1944, the dedicated one-way truck route ran from the Normandy beachhead toward the front. Nearly 6,000 vehicles, mostly the 2.5-ton GMC, the Deuce and a Half, the ugliest and most beloved truck this country ever built. Civilian traffic banned off the route, signs at every junction, drivers running day and night, headlights taped down to slits, 40 and 50 hours awake, some of them lashing themselves upright behind the wheel. At its peak, it moved something like 12,500 tons in a single day, and roughly 3 out of 4 of the men driving those trucks were black, in an army that segregated them, that fed them apart, housed them apart, and for most of the war would not let them fight, on the official theory that they lacked the qualities. Those men hauled the ammunition that killed the Wehrmacht. They hauled the gasoline that carried Patton across France. They were, in the most literal sense available in the English language, the reason the guns could speak. And the Red Ball Express was not a monument to American abundance, was a symptom of American failure. It existed because the Allies had not captured a working port. It existed because the railroads were rubble. It was an emergency, a bleeding, improvised, desperate patch over a supply system that had planned for a slow crawl and got a stampede, and it ate itself alive. The trucks burned staggering quantities of the very fuel they were carrying forward. They pounded the French roads to gravel and then to mud. They wore out faster than the depots could replace them, because the spare parts were also coming up that same broken road. Engines were run past every maintenance interval until they seized. Convoys leaked cargo. Men stole from them. The river of steel was not a river. It was a garden hose held together with tape, and the men holding it were half dead from exhaustion, and it was leaking the entire way. So, here is where this leaves you. The Germans looked across the hedgerows and saw an army with infinite shells, and they were wrong. The Americans were rationing. The Americans were scavenging captured 88s. The Americans were running out. The Germans looked across the hedgerows and saw an army throwing ammunition away out of sheer stupidity, and they were partly right. Some of it was bureaucratic waste, dumb and pointless, and written into the official record. And the man who had designed the whole bargain, the man who decided America would buy its victory in steel because it could not bear to pay in sons, was already in the ground in Normandy, killed by his own bombs, buried by 6 men in silence, his death a state secret. The machine was still running, the architect was dead, the ammunition was short, and in 5 months, on a snow-covered ridge in Belgium, a division that had never fired a shot in anger was going to prove that everything the Germans thought they understood about American waste was upside down. Because those wasted shells, the ones the Americans fired into empty forests in November at nothing, at no one, for no reason a German officer could accept, were not being wasted. They were being paid in advance. November 1944, Eastern Belgium. A place so quiet the army used it to rest divisions that had been chewed up somewhere else, and to break in divisions that had never been chewed at all. Into that quiet came the 99th Infantry Division. They were called the Battle Babies, and they had earned the name the hard way by not having earned anything at all. Not one of them had ever been shot at. They were spread along 22 miles of frozen forest, a frontage roughly 3 times what the manuals called reasonable. In country so cold, the ground had to be blasted with explosives before a man could dig a hole in it. They were nobody. They were the division you put where nothing happens. And in those weeks of nothing, the 99th did that any German's officer watching through field glasses would have filed under one word: waste. They fired their artillery. Not once, not by accident. Deliberately, methodically, day after day, they walked shells into the trees, into fire breaks with nothing in them, into a bend in a logging road where no one was standing, into a clearing on the far side of a stream that no one had crossed in a month. They were registering. They were taking every approach a German attacker could conceivably use. Every trail, every gap, every draw between the ridges, and they were shooting at it and watching where the round landed and correcting and shooting again and writing the numbers down. Deflection, elevation, charge, fuse. A number for a piece of empty Belgian woodland where nothing was happening and nothing would ever happen. They wrote it on a chart in a farmhouse and they put the chart in a drawer. To the Wehrmacht, this was professional obscenity. Shells are finite. Shells are counted. You do not throw them into an empty forest to make a note. The Americans threw them into an empty forest to make a note. 16th of December, 0530. The forest exploded. 90 minutes of German artillery, searchlights bouncing off the low cloud to make an artificial moon, and then the infantry came. The 277th Volksgrenadiers first, then the tanks and panzer grenadiers of the 12th SS Panzer Division. Boys, many of them, 16 and 17 years old, coming out of the tree line into the gray, and the American artillery answered in minutes. Not because the forward observers were geniuses, not because the gunners were brave, because the Zumbers were already in the drawer. Every trail those Germans came down had been shot at in November. Every clearing they crossed had a number. The Fire Direction Center did not have to find them. It only had to look them up. And here is the image I want you to carry out of this video, if you carry nothing else. The American infantrymen did not stand up. They stayed in their holes. They had roofed with felled timber, and they lay under the logs. And the shells went over, and the artillery did the killing. That is what the whole bargain bought. That is what 89 divisions and a fire direction center and 13,000 rounds on an empty hill in Normandy were for. So that on a morning in Belgium, an untested 19-year-old from Pennsylvania could lie in the frozen dirt with a log over his head and let the steel do his work for him. The 12th SS came at Rocherath and Krinkelt, the twin villages, the doorway to the ridge, and they broke themselves against it for 3 days. House to house. Panther tanks in narrow streets they could not turn around in. Bazooka rounds fired down from rooftops. The Nair side taking many prisoners, and when the villages were rubble, the Americans did something that looks like defeat and was not. Walter Robertson, commanding the 2nd Infantry Division, pulled out. He backed his men, battalion leapfrogging through battalion in the fog, onto the open high ground behind, onto the ridge, Elsenborn. And there, on that bare boomerang of frozen ground, the United States Army did the only thing it had ever been designed to do. It assembled the guns, not one division's guns, the Corps. More than 300 pieces went in behind that ridge. 105s, 155s, the 8-inch howitzers, the 4. 2-inch chemical mortars, sighted so that any square meter of ground in front of the infantry could be reached by all of them at once. The men in the foxholes passed a rumor around that the guns were parked hub to hub behind them. The rumor was not far wrong. 22nd of December. The German attack came in at Dom Buchenbach on the southern shoulder against the 26th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, the veterans who had already done North Africa and Sicily and Omaha Beach and did not particularly want to be here. The divisional artillery of the 1st Infantry Division fired approximately 10,000 rounds in that single day. 10,000 German tanks got through. Not one Panzergrenadier reached an American foxhole. Not one. They were killed in the open, between the tree line and the holes, by shells fired from guns whose crews never saw them, aimed at grid squares that had been measured in November when nothing was happening. In front of the 26th Infantry alone, American Graves registration counted 782 German dead. American patrols who went out afterward described the bodies in the snow as common as grass. Many of them were 16 years old. Now hold on, because on that exact same day, the 22nd of December 1944, 40-odd miles to the southwest, something was happening that turns this entire story inside out. In the encircled town of Bastogne, the acting quarter of the 101st Airborne Division issued an order. His name was Anthony McAuliffe. He was 46 years old, and he was not an infantryman. He was the division's artillery commander, a gunner, a man from the same church, the The same doctrine, the same Fort Sill mathematics. A man who believed, the way every American artilleryman believed, that you shoot at the place where he is likely to be, because shells are cheaper than suns. And on the 22nd of December, Anthony McAuliffe restricted his guns to 10 rounds per gun per day, 10. The number a German battery on the Russian front would have recognized instantly. Same army, same week, same doctrine, same war. One place drowning the enemy in 10,000 rounds a day, the other counting them out like coins. And the only difference between those two places, the entire difference, was a road. Elsenborn had roads open to the rear. Bastogne was surrounded. That was it. That was the whole of it. Steel for flesh is a magnificent bargain, and it holds right up until the moment a German tank column sits down across your supply route. Then the exchange rate collapses, and an American general who has spent his career learning to spend shells has to look at his gunners and tell them to stop. The doctrine was never invincible. It was only ever as strong as the truck route behind it. Now, the last thing. The thing I owe you, because it is the story everyone else tells, and it is wrong. You have heard that a secret weapon saved the Ardennes. The proximity fuse, the VT, the little radio in the nose of the shell that made it burst in the air above a foxhole instead of in the mud beside it, so that a hole in the ground stopped being cover. The Pentagon had refused to let field artillery use it over land. Terrified the Germans would recover a dud and copy it. Eisenhower demanded it. The ban came off during the Bulge. Patton wrote to Washington that the new shell with the funny fuse was devastating, and that they would have to rewrite the tactics of land warfare. It is a wonderful story. And the United States Army's own official history, the volume on the Ardennes, written by men with the records in front of them, says that the poor claims about the VT fuse halting the German advance are grossly exaggerated. It was fired on only a handful of occasions before January, usually at night, usually in weather so bad the gunners could not observe the burst of ordinary time-fused shells and had no better option sent. It was not the miracle. The miracle was the drawer. The miracle was a chart in a Belgian farmhouse with a number written on it in November for a bend in a logging road where nothing was happening. 26th of December. The 246th Volksgrenadier Division, conscripts, most of them, scraped out of the last barrel Germany had, made one final attack on the ridge. They were cut down by artillery, essentially, as they formed up. They never reached the American line. They never got a chance to. Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, the formation Hitler had trusted with the main effort, the spearhead of the last German offensive in the West, had beaten itself into uselessness against a hill. On the 16th of January, 1945, it was pulled out and sent east to die somewhere else. So, did it work? Yes, and I want to be very careful now, because this is where a story like this usually turns into a parade, and I am not going to give you one. The bill for this doctrine was not paid only by Germans. 111 Americans died under their own bombs at Saint-Lô, and a 3-star general went into the ground in secret, and his wife was told he was dead, but not how. Towns in Normandy and Belgium that had stood since before this country existed were pounded into gravel, and the people in them were not asked. Same winter, in those same beautiful covered foxholes, the American army in Europe took roughly 71,000 casualties from trench foot and frostbite, not from shells, from cold, from wet socks and bad boots and no way to get dry. Men lost toes, lost feet, lost the use of their legs for the rest of their lives, and no artillery on earth could shoot at that. Firepower does not make a war clean. It never has, and it never will. All it does is move the cost. It moves it off the rifleman and onto the factory, off the American boy and onto the German boy, off the 20-year-old in the hole and onto the town he is standing in. The Germans looked across at all that steel falling on empty ground and called it waste, because their doctrine had no other word for it. But they were not looking at waste. They were looking at a receipt. Somebody in Pennsylvania made that shell. Somebody in a segregated truck company drove it 400 miles without sleep. Somebody in a farmhouse wrote a number for a piece of forest where nothing was happening. And on a frozen ridge in Belgium in December of 1944, 19-year-old who had never fired a shot in anger stayed in his hole under a log and lived. That was the whole point. That was always the whole point. They were not trying to waste shells. They were trying to come home.